Thank you, Calvin. Good afternoon, guys. My name is Marlé, as Calvin mentioned, and today's meeting or presentation is going to be around understanding and addressing codependency in addiction. So today we will look at the following. We're going to look at what codependency is. How does codependency manifest in addiction? So why do we get codependent? We're going to look at how to recognize the signs of codependency. And we're also going to look at breaking the cycle of codependency. How can I support my loved one in a healthy way? Okay, so what is codependency? Codependency is an excessive emotional or psychological dependence on another person, typically in a relationship where one person is affected by addiction. It's a cycle where one person feels responsible for the well-being and behaviors of another, often at the cost of their own needs. It usually originates from a desire to care for or fix others, but can lead to unhealthy patterns. Okay, so how does codependency manifest in addiction? Let's start with caretaking and enabling. So examples would be providing financial support or making excuses for the addicted person's behavior. It's taking on responsibility that that person with addiction should manage themselves. So an example of this can be a father covers rent and bills for his daughter, even though she uses her income to fund her addiction. Another way that codependency manifests is through emotional manipulation. So we often have the fear of abandonment or rejection that may cause the codependent person to do whatever it takes to maintain the relationship. So an example of this is a family member continues to allow a relative to live with them despite the stress, fearing the person may end up homeless or cut ties. Another way that it manifests is through a loss of identity. The codependent sense of self-worth is tied to the well-being of the person struggling with addiction. So an example of this would be the wife feels successful or relieved only when her husband is sober, but becomes consumed with worry or anxiety at signs of relapse. And then the last way it manifests is sacrificing personal needs. So ignoring one's own health, social connections, and interests to focus on the addicted person. So this is just a few ways that it does manifest in addiction and what we often see people or families do. I think one that stands out for me very clearly is the emotional manipulation. A family member continues to allow the relative to live with them despite the stress, fearing the person may end up homeless. So how do we recognize the signs of codependency? Some of the signs would be feeling a constant need to rescue that person, your loved one, difficulty setting boundaries and saying no, feeling guilty or having anxiety when focusing on oneself, ignoring one's own needs or making sacrifices that are not reciprocated, a sense of responsibility for the addicted person's actions or emotions, and then feeling controlled by the loved one's behavior or mood. I think a lot of times when addicts come into treatment, the family has the sense of, I need to rescue the person. It's what we often see is family members would say, it's my fault that the person is addicted. And yes, you may have played a part in it. However, taking that blame onto yourself is a way of rescuing the addict, to take the responsibility away from them and to make their behaviors control sorry guys, it's late afternoon, taking on their behaviors and emotions and making your responsibility.
Yeah, if I may step in here, please. I think we see this so often. Loved ones are so relieved to get them into treatment. that when they come, they make promises that maybe they can't keep. They bribe or manipulate. Stay in treatment, I'll get you a car. I won't leave you and divorce you. Behave and I'll give you a prize. And that's enmeshed codependency, because they should be coming in because they want a better life and they're tired of being sick and tired of all the chaos that they're causing. And that's something to learn, I think, going forward, should they ever need to go into treatment again, is not to make any idle promises, or threats for that matter, and not to praise too much. A lot of loved ones put a lot of pressure, when they're saying goodbye and there's tears, and the addict often uses that as an excuse to get out, to go home. So, be careful of those signs, particularly on admission into a treatment facility.
Yeah,
Calvin, you
so
want to add
just
something?
going to add, maybe just speaking to the theme of your title there, how do you recognize some of the signs of codependency? I think a really easy way to, or a really sort of quick understanding is your own emotional exhaustion. I think you're, well, at the point here of breaking, you do feel, and you do feel the sense of exhaustion. And I think it's important to understand where this exhaustion is coming from, because we obviously have daily life and et cetera, et cetera. But I think a lot of the exhaustion we feel around codependent relationships comes from this idea that you really are almost being responsible for two people at once, right? Yourself and this person who's so reliant on you for so many aspects of their life. And that tax, because it is a lot of tax, I think is one of the easiest ways to recognize when you might just be in a codependent relationship.
Yeah, most definitely. Thanks, Cheryl. Thanks, Calvin, for sharing. We move on to breaking the cycle of codependency. So we're going to look at self-awareness and reflections, setting healthy boundaries and allowing consequences, focus on self-care, and seeking professional support. Okay, so when we start by self-awareness and reflections, so it's important to recognize and accept your patterns. So for example, do you feel anxious or guilty if you aren't able to help your loved one immediately? A practical tip that you can keep in mind is to start small by noting these feelings as they arise. So an example can be to have like a little piece of paper, maybe in your handbag or next to your drawer or your cupboard. And every time you have this feeling of, do I actually feel anxious or guilty if I don't help my loved one immediately? Start writing them down. Another thing to focus on is journaling and therapy. So an example is keeping a journal to track moments when you feel obligated to step in for your loved one's actions. So the action step that can be followed is to consider writing down patterns you notice or discuss them with a therapist or in a support group session. It's also important to set healthy boundaries, and boundaries is often something that a lot of families struggle with. So the big one is learning to say no and respecting your own limits. So an example would be if your loved one asks for financial help, but it impacts your own stability, practice saying, I can't support you at this moment. I can't support you right now. Establishing clear expectations. So an example would be communicate that you can provide emotional support, but won't make excuses for their behavior. So a practical tip that you can keep in mind is to avoid confusion, write down your boundaries, and share them clearly with your loved one. Before I move on, Calvin, Cheryl, you want to add something?
Yeah, I think just with self-awareness, I think you also know your family members at this point. You know how they play on your heartstrings. And so I think it's very important, as much as it is, I think in codependent relationships, there's such a history of really listening to this person, really taking on a lot of what they're saying. But I think part of the self-awareness is actually listening to your own voice at some point, and possibly even hearing those of the voices around you, because so often the voices around us are also screaming, this is problematic, this could be problematic, it seems like he's taking advantage, he might be using you. So I think it's also to hear those, and it's hard because sometimes the only voice we've heard is that of the addict or is that of our loved ones.
Mhm.
So I think part of the self-awareness is actually realizing that there are other voices in this relationship.
Most definitely. Okay. The next one on breaking the cycle of codependence is focus on self-care. So if you think back on what we said in the beginning around we feel guilty when we focus on self, which can be a symptom of codependency, it's of vital importance to engage in personal hobbies and interests. So an example would be to schedule time for your hobbies like reading, sports, or social outings. And an action step that you can take is to commit to a weekly activity. Maybe go for a yoga class or go to book club, where you can just be yourself and enjoy yourself. It's also important to remember that your needs matter too. So an example of this would be if you feel drained after a tough day with your loved one, take time to recharge with something you enjoy rather than pushing through. So a practical tip that you can take into consideration is to set aside 15 minutes a day for quiet reflection or an activity that energizes you. It's okay to say, I'm getting home around 5 p.m. For the next half an hour, it's my time. So whether that is me going to my room, reading a book, closing the door, and this is my time to say to your loved one, after this half an hour, then I can listen to you again. I think it's so important to keep in mind this particular step, because when there's codependency, we often lose ourselves and our own identity. We are so focused on that person. We take on their emotions, we take responsibility for their behavior, that we forget who we are and what we need at the end of the day. And then it's also important to seek professional support. First one is family therapy and support groups like this one tonight. It's important to attend therapy as a family. It can help you understand everyone's needs and find balance. An action step would be to join a local or online support group where you can share experiences and find community support. And then individual counseling. Therapy can help you uncover underlying emotional needs that may contribute to codependency. And a practical tip is to set a goal to explore counseling options if you're not already engaged in therapy. Usually when we speak to families, we say that this is a family disease, addiction. It not only affects the loved one, their lives and all areas of their lives, but it also affects the family and the people closest to them. So just like your loved one might be in treatment now or went through treatment, it's important for you to take this time to also heal your own heart and work on your own underlying emotional needs. Calvin, Cheryl?
I think I was just going to add, I think it sounds often silly when we talk about hobbies or self-care or something of these these little notions. Um, it's like, okay, I've got so much things to do. Why are you talking about my hobbies now? And while we're talking about a codependent relationship, But I think it's so symptomatic of the loss of meaning sometimes in your own life. A lot of these little uh, aspects of our life, these little things that we love to do, that these rituals sometimes, that make us, they're very often the things that make us who we are. They give very often they breathe life into our life. They give us meaning in some sense. Um, and it's such a symptomatic sign when you have no interests outside of your loved one, have no interests outside of this relationship, outside of the family, outside of that dynamic. It's so symptomatic that most of your life has been quite consumed by a lot of what's going on. And that's not to say, you know, it's not to say that this isn't quite emotionally draining. It is, and it is a huge aspect of your life. No one can deny that. But it shouldn't be your life. That's the point. And so, just this little thing, this idea of taking some interest in something you want, this taking some interest in a hobby you find enjoyable, is such an act of finding your own meaning outside of this relationship. Because as much as we find that the loved one pulls us into this codependent relationship, we also maintain it, right? This relationship in many ways is the thing that gives us meaning. And so it's also to break out of that cycle. And so I know it sounds really silly, finding a hobby, finding an interest, but part of breaking that cycle really is to start finding meaning in your own life as well, outside of this relationship.
Yeah, most definitely. If you think about the four components we just discussed, they are all intertwined with one another. Because if you don't focus on yourself and what your needs are, how are you going to become self-aware? If you don't seek professional support or attend these support groups where you can learn from other people's experiences, how are you going to learn how to set boundaries? So if you think about the four components, all of them, they work together. If you don't know yourself, you don't know what you need, how are you going to set boundaries if you don't know what you need? So it's very important to focus on all of them. Just like Calvin just said, it might seem silly to think about personal hobbies and interests at the moment. Some of you might even tell me, Marlé, I don't have the time now. I need to focus on my loved one in recovery. But it's really important to seek time for yourself, to remain in your own identity and not lose yourself in the process. Cheryl, you want to add something, or can I move forward? Okay, I think we can move forward. Okay, so then tips for supporting a loved one without enabling them. So the first one is encourage accountability. So let the person with addiction experience the natural consequences of their actions. So an example is if your loved one is consistently late or misses work due to substance use, avoid calling in on their behalf or covering for them. I think this is something that often happens, or what I've seen before is the loved one would call in and say, PT is sick today. He can't come into work. He's really, really sick. If you think about it, it's not your responsibility to phone his boss to make sure that he doesn't get into trouble. So a practical tip is to set clear boundaries regarding financial or housing support. So for an example, I'll provide support, but only if you meet certain expectations like attend meetings. Why this works is it helps loved one recognize the impact of their choices, and it fosters a sense of personal responsibility. And what is meant by that is to have that boundaries to say, if you use substances, fine, but if you lose your job, it's not on me. So that person, they knows that my wife or my girlfriend or partner or mom or dad is not going to phone in anymore. They're not going to phone my boss if I'm late because I used the previous night. Another tip for supporting a loved one is offer support without taking control. So show empathy and care, but avoid taking over responsibilities. So an example would be, instead of managing your loved one's finances or scheduling their recovery activities, ask how you can help them in making their own choices. So a practical tip would be, reframe offers to promote autonomy. Instead of let me do that for you, try how can I support you in handling this? And why this is necessary and why this works, it reinforces trust and it empowers the loved ones to regain control over their lives. I think this is something that I often see when a loved one is in treatment and it comes to the end of their primary care or stay with us, is in a conjoint we would ask, we ask the patient, how can your loved one support you? And usually in that time, the family would go into to say, okay, I'll manage your finances. I'll make sure you do your step work, you go to meetings. And that's where the whole thing comes in from. Instead of saying, let me do that for you, I'm going to make sure you do your step work every night from 6 to 7. You phone your sponsor in the morning at 8. You ask them, how can I support you in handling this? Calvin, before I move on, you want to add something?
No, I think Cheryl does though. Not okay.
No, not yet.
Okay. Okay, another tip would be to focus on positive communication. So use I statements to express your feelings without blaming. Avoid engaging in arguments when the loved one is under the influence. So the use of I statements, for example, is I feel worried when you don't follow through on your plans, instead of you always break your promises. A practical tip would be to practice expressing emotions without placing blame. This fosters understanding and reduces defensiveness. So the next one is to avoid arguments during a crisis. So for example, if your loved one is intoxicated, avoid serious discussions. Instead, let them know you'll talk when they're in a clear state of mind. So a practical tip would be, plan difficult conversations for a calm moment. Use phrases like, I'd love to talk about this when we can both be fully present. And why this works, it's positive communication, reduces conflict, and keeps the relationship constructive. I think avoid arguments during a crisis is sometimes hard to do as a family member. Sometimes we get so worked up and so angry and maybe disappointed that we want to address our loved one in that moment, to let them know how they're hurting you at the moment, to let them know about the behavior, what are they doing. But if you think about it, it's actually just going to cause conflict, because that person is not in the right state of mind to have a positive and a constructive conversation. And then promote healthy independency. So encourage your loved one to seek help and take active steps in their recovery. So if you look at encourage seeking help, an example is, if they express a need for support, suggest they contact a counselor or attend a support group rather than trying to fix things for them. So a practical tip would be to offer resources, such as a phone number for a local support group, without forcing them. Another tip would be to support active recovery steps. So an example is, celebrate when they make progress in their treatment plan. So recognize even small steps as achievements towards their independence. So a practical tip would be to set up small independent goals, like managing a daily schedule or attending a weekly group meeting. Why this works, it helps loved ones build self-efficiency and confidence in their ability to manage their recovery. Cheryl, Calvin, you want to add something to this?
Maybe just to add on to this positive communication, we sometimes have very skewed or warped perceptions of what is positive or negative. So, and I like that it speaks to, the statements around feelings without blaming, right? These positive statements can be negative things. They can be conflictual. They can be things that disagreements. They can be maybe not seeing eye to eye. But it doesn't have to be how it always has been, right? Where one person really gets their way, the other person really feels like maybe a bit even disempowered from the whole conversation. So I think don't get too caught up with the idea that the conversation has to be positive all the time. No, not at all. But how the communication unfolds has to be quite positive. Positive in scientific terms just means change, right? And so anything that's negative takes away, anything that's positive adds. And so really with speaking about in communication on how to add, how to benefit people, how to work with people, but not necessarily focusing on how can we be the most positive for this person, right? It gives allowance for you to express frustrations, for example, express conflicts, express dissatisfaction, but in much healthier ways than what perhaps one has done in the past, and allowing for more healthier ways from our loved ones too, because very often in codependent relationships, you find that they walk all over us. And so I think that's also what this positive communication is, to say, well, we're not really going to be talking like this right now. I'm not going to tolerate it. But when you're ready, and this is where the positive communication really comes in, when you're ready and you are going to speak to me in perhaps a bit more of a conducive manner, that's when we'll chat, right? And that's the real positive. That's the change here. I almost want to say that's the corrective emotional experience here.
Well, isn't
Yeah.
that really what we're talking about with codependency? Because a codependent person would try and reason with an intoxicated person and try and get them to see sense and try and get them to see how much their behavior is impacting the family, another person. And that's the codependence need. Because usually, if you speak to a chemically dependent person, they're like, shut up, leave me alone. I just want to chill. I want to stay in my high. I don't want to get into, there you go again. It's starting all over again. So if you're finding yourself doing that, and even if they're not intoxicated, maybe they're in treatment and you phone and you're saying, how's the program going? And they say, fine. But what are you doing? How many groups do you have? How's the food? Those are also signs of codependency.
And I think, Cheryl, it's so symptomatic of I was just reflecting in the moment how often we as practitioners get stuck in this exact moment where you just had said, we're trying to argue with them and trying to get them to see the reason so very often, and how we get pulled into the chaos so easily. And I think it's because very often it comes from a place of really just wanting to help. And so
Correct.
we practitioners even have to be so wary of our own value and our value to help others and to work with others, because very often that's what's being played on here. That's what's
Yeah.
being played with here, right? Is your need to actually help, which is the real crux of the difficulty here. And
Yeah.
we sort of say to you now, this lovely aspect of yourself that even practitioners have, right? This value inside of humanities. How do we say no? How do we, kind of stop you from doing that? And that's difficult, because that's a real part of who you are. That's a real value. But it's unfortunately the thing that's keeping them inside addiction. It's the thing that's keeping their behavior maintained in some ways. And so if you can't challenge this helping aspect of yourself, that behavior just won't change.
And I think we really do appreciate what we're saying here. We're asking everybody to, in essence, change their fundamentals that need to help that nurturer. But if you want to help your loved one, Marlé spoke earlier about responsibility and accountability. If you want to help them, you empower them to help themselves. So, asking, how's the food? It's small talk. I often say to families in the first 2-3 months, don't ask any questions. Sit and hold the space And that is excruciating for a loved one to do. Because they want to say, how many meetings have you been to? Have you got a nice sponsor? What's his number? Will he phone me? What did your therapist say? But ask ourselves, why do we need to know this? Are we trying to keep them in treatment? What's our intention? Or have we lost the ability of communicating in a healthy way with our loved one? And most families, and anybody on the platform tonight, I challenge you, try for 7 days. Don't ask any questions. Talk, but find new ways to communicate without asking, what are you doing? How's it going? Have you eaten? Even in our families, like most of us, if our parents phone, they go, hi, how you doing? Fine, thanks. Have you eaten tonight? Well, does it matter? You know, we've got built-in mechanisms that if we're hungry, we eat, and if we don't, well, unless we're an eating disorder, but that's how intrinsic this behavior becomes.
Yeah. Okay, so resources that's for you guys is support groups for families. So the support group that you're currently on, we'd encourage you to keep on joining it. But you can also go to Al-Anon Family Support Group. So it supports families of those struggling with alcohol addiction. And then Naranon Family Groups, it supports for families of drug-dependent individuals. Other hotlines that you can contact is the South African Depression and Anxiety Group. It's a 24-hour support line for mental health crises and addiction support. And then also the South African National Council of Alcoholism and Drug Dependence. It provides counseling, treatment, and prevention programs. So in today's meeting or PowerPoint, what we discuss is to understand codependency. So it's a condition where one's identity and well-being becomes entangled with another's. Codependency in addiction. So codependency often leads to enabling behavior, which can perpetuate addiction. Recognizing the signs. So difficulty in setting boundaries, prioritizing others over oneself, and feeling responsible for another's actions are all signs of codependency. And then breaking the cycle. So practice self-care, set healthy boundaries, and seek support is all essential steps to overcome codependency. From my side, my final thoughts are taking care of yourself is one of the most powerful ways to show your loved one that recovery is possible for both you and your loved one. Cheryl, Calvin, any final thoughts that you would like to add before we go to the questions?
I think just a tip for families. If you're finding yourself saying yes, but it's one of the clearest indications that you're struggling with codependency. Transferring your emotions onto somebody else. Like, it's cold, you must put on a jersey. Instead of saying, I'm cold, I'm going to put on a jersey. Wonder what you're going to do. So we've become so entrenched in precipitating another person's needs. It's not always just with our loved one. It can be with our colleagues, it can be with our siblings, it can be with our friends, our animals, people that work for us. It's a state. We get into a state of survival and coping, and it becomes so normalized that we think for another person. And I hope we're going to get lots of questions because this is a very difficult topic. And I think very often people who struggle with codependency think we're finding fault with them. Instead of saying, there's ways to change. And we do see that when families start making those small significant changes and the loved one is participating in their own recovery program, we see results. But it doesn't really help your loved one or the process if they come out of treatment, they've learned boundaries, they've had rules, they've had a system that's held them, to come home and give them praise and no accountability, no responsibility. You're undoing everything we've done. But it mustn't be done with anger. It mustn't be done with malice. It mustn't be done with historical trauma. It must be done with, I'm working through my stuff and you work through yours, and we'll communicate lightly until we've done some work.
Alvin, you want to add something before we open it for questions?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think there's very often a lot of negative connotation with the idea of codependency, and I think it's really what Cheryl's speaking to. But I think the important thing to remember, especially with codependency, is life is chaos, all right? Life is so difficult. We don't know what we're doing half the time. We don't know where we're going half the time. And so a lot of codependency is natural, right? We gravitate towards people. We need people. We rely on people. We socialize with people. People are a big aspect of our lives, 100% all the way through. But at some point, you survive the chaos. That's the real crux here. And yes, there may have been some kind of life event where you really, you know, gravitated towards each other. Maybe a loved one died very early, and you know, you got locked into this kind of relationship where you really needed to care for this child alone, or etc. Many things happen in life, right? There's not just one kind of situation that leads to codependency at all. But the one thing is that it's normally just really life that brings, the circumstances of life bring people to this point, right? But I think what we forget so often is that we have survived that experience. We have survived the traumatic childhood. We have survived the parent dying. We have survived the car crash. We have survived whatever has been thrown away, right? And that codependency, or that dependency that we needed each other for in that moment, is no longer valuable. We're clinging onto it, right? And so at some point, you also need to realize that that's been moved on from. And now I need to grow past that. And it's difficult because sometimes it's still really fresh for us and still really stings. But the main thing for you and for your loved one is that you do begin moving on from that, because it's no longer helpful. It was. That's why it happens, right? That's why we fall into this. And so it's not really a negative thing. Don't get caught up in the mindset that codependency is the worst thing possible and we're trying to leave you with a judgment. No, it was actually very necessary for for that time, for that period. But it's no longer necessary. And in fact, it's now detrimental.
Yeah, thank you. There's a really cool question. What are the typical responses one can expect from loved ones when codependent tendencies decrease on our end? Can it be perceived as lack of love, concern, that if that is the typical communication they're used to, how can we avoid defaulting back to old habits? Aliaga, you always ask beautiful questions. Yeah, I can start here. I think it's so relevant because when we do start to change, we don't get positive reactions at all. We get a lot of kickback, we get a lot of negativity, more manipulation, victim mentality, aggression. They don't take it very well. So it's often good to start it when they're in treatment, because then the treatment process holds them. Very few of us can. I think we only really address it when we're tired of being in our own heads, when we're sick and tired of being sick and tired. So whenever it starts, it's okay. But expect there to be kickback, expect there to be some trauma. And how do we avoid defaulting back to old habits? In 2 slides ago, Marlé spoke about the 12 steps and family support. And that's really it. It's getting help, seeing a therapist, joining the 12-step, doing your own 12 steps and joining groups. Because we relapse far quicker than the addicts do. If an addict had to drink or use drugs as often as we, the family members, relapsing codependency, they would be dead in about 2 days. Because it's harder for us to change our intrinsic belief, because that belief is also there, possibly from trauma in our younger days, in our childhood, but definitely trauma from living with addiction. So that's why a person's journey is so important. I remember going into my first Naranon meeting and sitting there thinking, these people are nutcases. They only talking about themselves. They're not like, there's no tips on how to help the addict. There's no like guidelines. How's this going to help? But when you go more often and you start working your own program, somehow the answers just sort of come to you. And I didn't need questions answered. I needed a space to talk about my own insanity and not get judged. So like the addict goes to an NA meeting, he or she can speak about their insanity, nobody judges them. What we as codependents do is equally insane. We just think we're helping. The addict doesn't really care, they just want to get high. But our addiction is to helping somebody hurt themselves. That's insane.
Maybe just to add on from my side, and I really agree, it's a lovely question. And earlier on, maybe I reflected on what Marlé had said about how our burnout and our own fatigue is a great way of identifying when we might be in a codependent relationship. And I think this question also speaks really to it. I think it's also a great way of recognizing what's going on. And maybe a quick example is, if you tell a friend, I can't help you move this week, or no, I can't lend you money, their reaction, if you're not really in a codependent relationship, would be quite reasonable. It wouldn't be, with the usual flair. It wouldn't have this massive blowout. It shouldn't, right? And so, that's a non-codependent relationship. That was just you saying, I don't have the money to help out this month. Sorry, can't do it. And the reaction is quite kind of normal. The relationship is still kind of maintained, even though you didn't lend this person money. But when you find yourself in a codependent relationship, that reaction, I think, is so symptomatic of the dynamic you may find yourself in. If they're pulling at these strings and there is this craziness and this insanity unfolding all of a sudden, because they didn't get their way, I think it speaks a lot to kind of the relationship you guys have had and the enabling nature that's been going on for some time. Once again, that's not a judgment statement to say that this enabling behavior wasn't necessary at some point. I think it always stems from some kind of necessity initially, but right now it's the thing that's doing them harm. And so it's important to speak to that.
Thanks, Calvin. Doreen's also got a great question. I'm struggling with this topic. I don't quite understand how I could be codependent. I have a zero tolerance attitude and hate what the addiction is doing to the family. How is it possible to be codependent? I think you're speaking to so many people, so many of us. I think I hated the addiction. I hated the chaos. I hated the substances. I went through a stage of hating the dealers. But I think in a very brief roundabout way is how much airtime does it take up in our head? How does it impact our behavior? How much energy are we putting in? And emotionally, what does this do to us? Because, zero tolerance and hate are very strong emotions, and they come as a result of very vulnerable emotions. So, what do we do with that? I also think we go through stages, and I think we go through ebbs and flows of being codependent and not. And I don't know if absolutely every single person in the addict's life is codependent, but I think we all have traits. Some of us have it as an affliction, and some have it as a little bit here and a little bit there. It was once said, and I don't know where I read it in quote, unquote, but each addict used to be said to affect 16 people around them and impact their lives by their usage. And that is direct family, it's extended family, it's teachers, it's colleagues, it's public at large, it's doctors, nurses, pastors, priests. And that says a lot. If you think logically, if one person comes in and screaming and shouting, let's say onto this platform, screaming and shouting, beating a drum, and they've got no clothes on, we're not going to invite him in for lunch next week. But we do that with our loved ones because we think we have to. We think it's the right thing to do. Saying no to borrowing money, helping somebody out is also another area. If you struggle with no, check out codependency. If you want to fix people, dogs, cats, look into it. Like Calvin keeps saying, it's not a negativity. It's been such a vital defense mechanism that we've used to survive. But the question is our codependency causing harm? Codependent families, these dynamics are prevalent. Remember that codependents don't believe they're causing harm. They really intrinsically, with every fiber of their being, believe they are helping. So why should they change? So I think very often in that family dynamic, the person who is maybe working on themselves, working on their codependency, they pull themselves out of the drama triangle. So they're no longer persecuting, rescuing, or enabling. Victim, rescue, and persecute. But they're looking after themselves. And I know that we're scared, if it is you in this case, Nadia, I think I can't look after myself. This loved one's just comes through treatment. He needs us. Maybe not. It's up to each person's responsibility to work on themselves in relation to the addiction. Now, if you think about it, I've been running family support groups for 30 years. We should have 25,000 people on this platform that have come through our doors over the years. Why don't we? Because people think they're doing better. They're in recovery, they've recovered, or this doesn't work. It's never going to work for me. I'll go look for something else. And invariably, we always land up back to a support group because we're the ones that are living with it. We're the ones that are really struggling with it. But I don't believe we can make anybody change. And I love the codependent serenity prayer. It says, God, grant me the serenity to accept the people I cannot change, the courage to change the one I can, and the wisdom to know that it's me.
Oh.
And I think, Nadia, a really important point of reflection that I think Cheryl's really touching on is just think about how you opened up this question. How do I stop this codependent person from being codependent in my loved one's life? And so you can see how much energy you're investing into your loved one's codependency with another relationship. So I'm almost going to say there's so much codependency or so much energy invested just into this codependency, and how much that has to fuel your worries and your anxieties. And you can see how quickly we can get trapped into the cycle, right? Because that's a normal worry. This person I've identified to be a real issue, an enabler in their life. But you can see how quickly we fill in that role. Then how can we save this person? How can we get them out of this relationship? And the reality is we can't. The reality is that boundaries are really important, but here in this particular case, your own boundaries are important. And, you know, hopefully your loved one does go through some kind of care system long enough to learn how to put in those own boundaries themselves.
An isolated event. It took years to manifest. I think certain people, it's my own belief, certain people are attracted to chemically dependent people because of some of their own stuff. So we end up marrying them, we end up being friends with them, and it takes a whole village to raise a kid, but it also takes a whole village to work through addiction, because the addict in the past has created this dynamic that's worked for them, having the family in conflict, having people running around for them. You know, it was an unconscious process, but a process nonetheless. So it takes time. It can take 10 years to get right what you are needing to get right now. So going back to getting help for yourself, finding a good addiction-wise therapist, support groups, educate yourself, but don't expect it to be in the next 2 or 3 years. And that is why we say one day at a time.
And I think I love how we open the groups because it always, I think, sets the vignette for what we're trying to achieve here. And part of that vignette, or one of the lines that's often said when we start in the preamble, is you know, we hope that you can learn your own boundaries and, more importantly, bottom lines. And at some point, you really have to start reflecting on what that bottom line looks for you. At what point you simply just completely walk away from the situation. And I don't mean to say that you're walking away from your partner or walking away from a family member or a loved one. I literally mean just this actual situation, saying, I'm not entertaining this anymore. This is not something I'm going to and that's where you protect yourself. And as horrible as it is, because we have such a need to help, such an ethic sometimes to do what's right, what seems right. But in some particular cases, it's really doing more harm than good.
Difference is when somebody's in active addiction, you do need to set harder, firmer bottom lines and boundaries. When they're in recovery, then we learn new ways of supporting recovery without enabling, and we'll make mistakes. And we've got to be willing to make those mistakes. You know, sometimes we'll say, all right, I'm going to pay for treatment, but nothing else. And then they say, cool, thank you very much. I'm really grateful. Thank you for paying for treatment. And then a week or two, everything's hunky-dory. Then their tire bursts, so you pay for the tire. You know, you said you weren't going to, but you have done. Now what? So there isn't absolutes. And it's about self-education and self-support and self-nurturing and understanding that takes a lifetime. I can't stress that enough. This is just 1 hour of information that we're giving you that can take most of us a decade to intrinsically understand. When are we codependent? Why are we codependent? And what are we going to do about it? Just the fact you're here asking questions, awesome. That's what your loved one needs. But you're not going to do it perfectly. Where there's emotions involved, we are going to make big mistakes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, guys.
I think just maybe adding on to what Cheryl would say, and then relating it back to the slides in particular, you know, when those mistakes do happen, it's just about taking accountability for them too. They do happen. They even happen with us as professionals all the time. And so it's to just say, you know, at this point, you know, I let this happen for too long, and I cannot let this occur anymore, type of thing. This has been going on for too much. You've simply taken too much. You're simply taking too much. And that will change too. You know, that as trust is earned, as things do get better over a number of years, boundaries change. It's not to say that you can't change them. Values don't change though. Values are a bit more rigid, I'd say. And so it's to kind of distinguish what are your boundaries and what are your values here. You know,
Mhm.
a real value is you will not harm me, for example. That's not something that will easily be negotiated over a number of years, or shouldn't be, shall I rather say.